A message came on a Tuesday morning when the sun was just rising over New York City. It appeared in the center of the United Nations, building as a ball of pure light that floated 3 feet above the floor and spoke in every language at once. The message was simple, but it changed everything humanity had ever believed about their place in the universe. Earth had been watched for 300 years, and now humanity was invited to send one, representative to something called the Galactic Council of Civilizations. The world went mad with excitement and fear and wonder all mixed together. Governments argued and scientists theorized and religious leaders prayed for guidance. But eventually, they made a choice. Ambassador Elena Vasquez was a woman of 52 years who had seen more of human nature than most people ever would. She had been born in a refugee camp during a war that killed her parents before she turned 5. She had learned 7 languages by the time she was 20, and had spent her life trying to build bridges between people who wanted to destroy each other. She had survived 3 wars and still believed that peace was possible. She was not chosen because she was the smartest or the strongest or the most powerful. She was chosen because she understood something fundamental about what it meant to be human. The journey took 14 months through something the aliens called fold space. Elena spent that time learning everything she could from the small tablet they had given her. She learned that the galaxy was old beyond imagination. She learned that thousands of species had risen and fallen and risen again across billions of years. She learned that humanity was considered young and primitive and barely worth noticing. When her small shuttle finally docked at Axis Prime, she stepped out into a world that made her feel like an ant walking into a cathedral built for giants. Axis Prime was a station at the very heart of the galaxy where 10,000 different species had gathered for millions of years to trade and argue and decide the fate of entire worlds. The promenade stretched before her like an endless river of impossible life. She saw beings made entirely of crystal who moved in perfect harmony with each other as if they shared one mind. She saw creatures from gas giant planets who floated in massive pressure suits filled with swirling storms. She saw machines that had been alive and thinking since before Earth even existed. She saw things she could not name or understand or even properly look at without her eyes hurting. They moved around her like water flowing around a small stone. None of them looked at her twice. Elena had read her own species file on the journey, and she knew what they thought of humanity, young and aggressive and primitive. Species that had spent most of its existence killing itself in wars over land and resources and ideas. A planet that had been marked as a potential mining site once the humans inevitably destroyed themselves. She was not surprised by their contempt. She had seen the same look in the eyes of powerful humans when they looked at refugees and immigrants and anyone they considered beneath them. The council chamber was vast beyond reason. It could hold representatives from 10,000 species and still have room for more. Elena was assigned a seat at the very back behind a species of fungal colonies that communicated by releasing clouds of spores into the air. She was told she could observe the proceedings, but speaking rights would be considered in another century or 2. She did not argue. She simply sat down and began to watch and listen and learn. The council arbiter was a being of pure energy contained within a geometric shell that shifted and changed as it moved. It had held this position for longer than human civilization had existed. The debates were about things. Elena could barely comprehend trade routes between star clusters and mining rights and nebulae and treaties with species that lived in dimensions she could not perceive. She understood perhaps 1 word in 10, but she watched the way they spoke to each other. She watched who had power and who did not. She watched who was respected and who was ignored, and she began to understand exactly what humanity was dealing with. There was a species called the Keth, who seemed to command attention whenever they spoke. They were tall and scaled and walked on 2 legs like humans, but that was where the similarity ended. Their empire spanned 900 star systems, and their history stretched back millions of years. When they spoke, the chamber grew quiet, and others listened. There were the machine intelligences who never raised their voices, but whose words carried the weight of pure logic and calculation. There were the crystalline hive minds who spoke as one voice, representing billions of individual beings. There were species so old that they remembered when the galaxy was young and stars were still being born. And there at the very back sat Elena Vasquez, representing a species that had only discovered fire 100,000 years ago. She felt very small, but she did not feel hopeless. Elena had grown up small and powerless in a world that did not care whether she lived or died. She had learned that size and power were not the same as wisdom and worth. She had learned that the meek did not inherit the earth by waiting for someone to give it to them. They inherited it by refusing to disappear. So she sat in her seat at the back of the chamber, and she watched, and she listened, and she learned. She learned who had allies and who had enemies. She learned which species could be reasoned with and which could not. She learned the ancient rules and customs that governed this place. She learned that there was a thing called the right of witness that allowed any species to speak once on behalf of another. It had not been used in 6,000 years because everyone had forgotten that it existed. Everyone except Elena Vasquez, who read every document she could find and remembered everything. The other delegates ignored her completely. They walked past her seat without seeing her. They spoke of humanity as if she was not even there. They laughed at jokes about the primitive apes from the spiral arm, who would probably blow themselves up before the next council session. Elena smiled and nodded and said nothing. She had learned patience in refugee camps and war zones and diplomatic negotiations that lasted for years. She could wait, she could watch, she could learn. And when the time came, she would show them exactly what humanity was made of. The galaxy was about to learn that the most dangerous creature in the universe was not the largest or the oldest or the most powerful. It was the one that refused to give up. 3 months passed, and Elena Vasquez learned more about the galaxy than any human had ever known. She learned that the council was not a place of justice or fairness. It was a place where the strong made rules and the weak followed them or suffered the consequences. She learned that species disappeared all the time and nobody asked questions. She learned that empires rose and fell and the ancient powers simply adjusted their trade agreements and moved on a day that felt like any other. The Dominion of Keth brought a proposal before the council. The Keth delegate was a massive creature covered in dark green scales with eyes that reflected no light. His name was impossible for human tongues to pronounce, so Elena simply thought of him as the commander. He stood at the central platform and addressed the assembled thousands with the casual confidence of someone who had never been told no. There was a young civilization in the Outer Rim, he explained. They had recently developed the ability to travel faster than light. This should have been cause for celebration, but instead it was presented as a problem. The young species had refused to submit to galactic law. They wanted to develop on their own terms. They wanted freedom. The commander smiled with too many teeth and asked the council for permission to pacify them. Everyone knew what pacification meant. It meant warships in orbit around their planet. It meant demands delivered at gunpoint. It meant the death of anyone who resisted and the enslavement of anyone who survived. Elena felt her blood turn cold as she listened to the casual way they discussed destroying an entire civilization. She looked around the chamber, hoping someone would object. The crystalline hive mind sat in contemplative silence. The machine intelligences calculated probabilities and said nothing. The gas giant dwellers floated in their pressure suits and made no move to speak. Nobody was going to say anything. Nobody was going to help. And that was when Elena Vasquez stood up. The chamber fell silent in a way that had nothing to do with respect. It was the silence of confusion and disbelief. The fungal colonies beside her released clouds of spores that smelled like surprise. The Kef commander turned his lightless eyes toward the back of the chamber, and his translator crackled with what might have been laughter. "The human speaks," said the arbiter in a voice that echoed from its geometric shell. "You have not been granted voice." Elena walked forward through the silence. Her footsteps were the only sound in a chamber that could hold millions. "I am taking it," she said. "I invoke the right of witness." The murmur that rippled through the chamber was like a wave passing through an ocean. Species that had not spoken to each other in centuries turned to look at the small human woman walking toward the central platform. The right of witness was ancient. It was from an age when the council still believed in things like fairness and protection for the weak. Any species could invoke it once and only once to speak on behalf of another species that could not speak. For themselves, nobody had used it in 6,000 years. The arbiter's geometric shell shifted through colors that might have indicated surprise. "You would spend your only witness on a species you have never met," said the Kef commander with obvious amusement. "Humans truly are as foolish as the reports suggest." Elena reached the central platform and looked up at the vast chamber filled with ancient powers who had never given her a second thought. "I would spend it on anyone facing what you are proposing," she said, and then she began to speak. She spoke for 11 minutes without stopping. She spoke of sovereignty and the right of every civilization to make its own choices and its own mistakes. She spoke of the moral emptiness of empire. Dressed in the language of law and order, she quoted their own ancient charters back at them. She cited treaties they had signed and promises they had made and principles they claimed to uphold. She was precise, and she was relentless, and she did not back down. When she finished, the chamber was quiet in a different way. It was the quiet of beings who were not sure what they had just witnessed. The Kef commander rose to his full height and looked down at her with contempt it had been building for. Millions of years of unchallenged dominance. How quaint! His translator dripped with condescension. "The infant species lectures us on morality." He turned to address the chamber as if Elena was no longer worth looking at. "Tell me, human," he said with his back to her, "how many of your own kind did you slaughter before you even reached your moon? How many wars have you fought over patches of dirt and differences in belief? Your species is defined by violence, and you have no standing to speak of ethics to us." Laughter erupted through the chamber. It came in 1,000 different forms from 1,000 different species, chittering and humming and flashing lights and vibrating membranes. All of it meant the same thing: you are nothing. You are less than nothing. You are a joke. Elena stood at the center of all that laughter, and she did not flinch. She waited until it faded, and then she spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the vast chamber. "You are right," she said quietly. "We are violent. We have committed horrors against ourselves that would sicken every being in this chamber. We know exactly what we are capable of." She paused, and the silence returned. "That is precisely why I am standing here." The Kef commander turned back to face her, and for just a moment something flickered in those lightless eyes. It might have been confusion. It might have been the first small seed of doubt. "I know what happens when the strong decide the weak do not deserve to exist." Elena continued, "I have seen it with my own eyes. I have buried the bodies. I have held the survivors while they wept. And I have spent my entire life trying to make sure it never happens again." She looked around the chamber at the ancient powers who ruled the galaxy. "You are old," she said. "So old that you have forgotten what it feels like to be young and afraid and alone. You have forgotten what it means to face something stronger than yourself and refuse to kneel. But I have not forgotten. Humanity has not forgotten. And we never will." The vote was called. The Kef proposal passed by an overwhelming margin. The young civilization in the Outer Rim was pacified within the year. Elena Vasquez returned to her seat at the back of the chamber and did not speak again for a very long time. But she had done something that day that could never be undone. She had made them see her. She had made them remember her face. And deep in the hearts of 10,000 species, a small seed had been planted, a seed of doubt, a seed of wonder, a seed that asked a simple question. What kind of species puts its only voice defending strangers it has never met? The answer to that question would take years to become clear, but when it did, the galaxy would never be the same. 4 years had passed since Elena Vasquez first set foot on Axis Prime. 4 years of watching, learning, and waiting in the back of the council chamber. 4 years of being ignored and dismissed and treated like a curiosity rather than a representative of a thinking species. And then the Vorn came with their warning, and everything changed. The Vorn were a species that nobody really understood. They lived in an isolated cluster at the edge of known space, and they rarely interacted with the rest of the galaxy. They were tall and thin with skin that seemed to shift between solid and liquid. Their eyes held depths that made even the oldest species uncomfortable. When they spoke, the galaxy listened because the Vorn only spoke when something truly important was happening. The Vorn delegates stood at the central platform and delivered a message that would echo through history. Something was moving in the void between galaxies, something that consumed, something that left nothing behind. They had detected it at the very edge of sensor range, a wave of absolute darkness drifting closer with each passing day. The council debated. The Keth dismissed it as Vorn mysticism and superstition. The machine intelligences ran probability calculations. That came back with no clear answer. The crystalline hive minds retreated into deep contemplation that could last for centuries. The gas giant dwellers argued that more data was needed before any action could be taken. For 18 months, the greatest civilizations in the galaxy argued about whether the threat was even real. And then the first colony went dark. It was a small outpost at the edge of the Outer Rim. One day it was sending regular transmissions, and the next day there was nothing. No distress signal, no debris, no trace that it had ever existed at all. The council debated some more. A second colony disappeared. Then a third. Then an entire star system with 4 inhabited worlds and billions of beings simply stopped existing. The debates grew more urgent but no less endless. Species accused each other of deception and manipulation. Old rivalries flared up as fear took hold. Nobody could agree on what to do because nobody could accept what they were facing. Elena Vasquez requested permission to address the council. She was no longer the unknown newcomer from the primitive species at the back of the chamber. 4 years of patient work had earned humanity a grudging measure of respect. She had contributed to research projects and offered perspectives that the ancient species had never considered. She had proven that humans could be useful even if they were still seen as children playing at the adults' table. The Arbiter granted her request, and Elena walked to the central platform one more time. 10,000 species turned their attention to the small, soft creature who had stood in this same spot years ago and been laughed at. My government has been analyzing the data, she said. We believe we understand what you are facing. Enlighten us. The Arbiter said with something that might have been genuine interest. Elena looked around the chamber at the ancient powers who had ruled the galaxy since before Earth existed. You have grown old, she said. All of you. Your civilizations span millions of years. You have seen everything. You have survived everything. And somewhere along the way you forgot how to be afraid. The silence that followed was not contemptuous. It was uncomfortable. This thing that is coming does not negotiate. Elena continued. It does not make threats. It does not want territory or resources or submission. It simply arrives, and then there is nothing. She let her words settle over the chamber like a cold wind. You have spent 18 months debating, because you cannot conceive of something you cannot reason with or bargain with or outlast. You have built your entire civilization on the assumption that everything can be understood and controlled, if you just have enough time and enough knowledge. Shook her head slowly. But some things do not want to be understood. Some things simply want to end you. The Kef commander rose from his seat with anger burning in his lightless eyes. "And what would you know of such things?" he demanded. "Your species has existed for a heartbeat. You have never faced a true existential threat." Elena turned to face him, and something in her expression made the ancient warrior hesitate. "We have faced it every single day of our existence," she said quietly. "We have looked into the eyes of our own destruction 1,000 times. We have built weapons capable of ending our entire world, and we have come within moments of using them. We have watched our own kind commit horrors that defy description, and we have survived." She turned back to the chamber. "Humanity understands something that you have forgotten," she said. "We understand that the universe does not care whether we live or die. We understand that there are forces beyond our control and beyond our comprehension. We understand that sometimes the darkness wins." Her voice grew stronger. "But we also understand something else. We understand that you can fight even when you know you cannot win. You can rage against the dark, even when the dark is all there is. You can refuse to surrender, even when surrender is the only logical choice." She looked at the representatives of 10,000 species who had never truly known fear. "That is what you need right now. You need a species that knows how to fight when everything is already lost. You need a species that will not stop, because stopping was never in our nature." The Keth commander stared at her with an expression that was impossible to read. "And what would you suggest?" he asked without mockery for the first time. "Stop debating," Elena said. "Start preparing, and let us help. Because if there is one thing humans understand, it is how to keep fighting when all hope is gone." Nobody laughed for the first time. Since humanity had entered the galactic stage, nobody laughed at their representative. Something had shifted in the chamber. Something fundamental had changed. The ancient species of the galaxy looked at the human woman standing alone at the central platform, and they saw something they had not seen in a very long time. They saw hope. Not the easy hope of certainty and power, but the harder hope of defiance and determination. The hope that says the darkness may be coming, but we will meet it standing. The council voted to form a unified response to the threat. For the first time in recorded history, every species agreed to work together. And at the center of it all stood humanity. The young species that had arrived as a joke and was becoming something else entirely. The war was coming, and humanity would show the galaxy what they were made of. The war lasted 9 years, and it was not really a war at all. A war implies two sides fighting for something. This was simply survival against annihilation. The entity had no name because it had never needed one. It had no origin that anyone could discover. It had no demands because it wanted nothing except to consume. It moved through space like a tide of absolute darkness, and where it passed, even the fabric of reality seemed to come undone. Stars went out, planets crumbled into dust that then faded into nothing. Entire civilizations that had lasted for millions of years simply ceased to exist as if they had never been real at all. The greatest weapons of the oldest species did nothing against it. The Keth fired planet-killing beams that vanished into the darkness without effect. The machine intelligences deployed self-replicating war machines by the billions and watched them dissolve into emptiness. The crystalline hive minds tried to communicate with it and felt their shared consciousness shatter from the contact. Nothing worked. The most advanced shields lasted minutes at best. The fastest ships could not outrun it. The most brilliant minds could not understand it. By the third year of the war, a quarter of the galaxy had gone dark. Species that had endured since the universe was young simply disappeared, and nobody could do anything to stop it. Humanity should have been irrelevant in this conflict. Their ships were primitive compared to galactic standards. They've been irrelevant in this conflict. Their ships were primitive compared to galactic standards. Their weapons were laughable. Their numbers were tiny. Their technology was millions of years behind the ancient powers. But they kept fighting. When the Keth battle fleet broke and scattered at Axis Tertius, it was human volunteers who flew into the gap. Their ships were held together with improvised repairs and desperate hope. They knew they could not win. They flew in anyway. 300 human vessels faced the darkness that day. 17 survived. That they bought enough time for the Keth to regroup and save 2 billion lives on the stations behind them. When the machine intelligences calculated that defense of the Orion Spur was mathematically futile, the human commanders looked at their projections and shrugged. Then they launched an offensive that made no logical sense at all. They attacked the darkness with everything they had, knowing they would lose, and somehow they won. Not a victory that destroyed the enemy, but a victory that slowed it down, a victory that bought 3 star systems another decade of existence. Decade after decade, battle after battle. The humans kept fighting and kept dying in numbers that should have broken any species. Earth itself was evacuated in the 5th year of the war. The blue planet that had given birth to humanity was abandoned as the darkness crept closer. Billions of humans scattered across 100 refugee stations throughout the galaxy. They had no home anymore. They had nothing left except the will to keep going, and still, they did not stop. The other species began to watch them differently. The Keth warriors who had laughed at humans in the council chamber now stood shoulder to shoulder with them in battle. They had seen human soldiers charge into certain death with songs on their lips and defiance in their eyes. They had seen human pilots fly broken ships into the heart of the darkness to buy a few more seconds for their comrades to escape. They did not understand it, but they respected it. The crystalline hive minds began coordinating their tactics with human strategists. They discovered that humans thought about war in ways that no other species did. Humans were creative in their desperation. They found solutions that made no sense until suddenly they worked. The gas giant dwellers shed propulsion, technology they had hoarded for millennia. The machine intelligences opened their archives of forbidden weapons. Even the Vorn, who had first brought the warning, emerged from their isolation to fight alongside the young species that had impressed them. In the 7th year of the war, the Arbiter found Elena Vasquez in the observation deck of a refugee station watching the stars. She was old now, with gray hair and lines on her face that spoke of too many losses, but her eyes were still fierce. "Why?" the Arbiter asked in its shifting geometric voice. "Your species has lost more than anyone. Your homeworld is gone. Your people die in greater numbers than any other. Why do you keep fighting?" Elena smiled, and there was something in that smile that made the ancient being uncomfortable. "Because we do not know how to stop," she said. "Because giving up was never in our nature. Because somewhere deep in our bones, we carry the memory of every ancestor who faced impossible odds and refused to die." She turned to look at the Arbiter. "And because we have always known that the universe does not care whether we live or die," she said, "we decided to care anyway." The breakthrough came 3 months later. A Vorn researcher working alongside human scientists in a hidden laboratory made a discovery. There was a frequency buried deep in the structure of the entity, a resonance in its very being that could be disrupted. If they could build a weapon that produced that frequency and deliver it to the heart of the darkness, they might be able to destroy it. The technology was beyond anything that existed. The delivery system would need to penetrate the entity and survive long enough to deploy the weapon. Every model said it was impossible. Every calculation said it could not be done. The humans built it anyway. They built it with Keth metallurgy and machine intelligence, processing power and Vorn insights and crystalline navigation systems. They built it with the combined knowledge of a galaxy that had finally learned to work together. They built it with human stubbornness and human hope and human refusal to accept the impossible, and when it was finished, 12 ships were prepared to carry it into the darkness. 12 ships crewed entirely by humans, because in the end, everyone understood that this mission required something the ancient species did not possess. It required beings who had never learned when to quit. The galaxy watched as the 12 ships launched toward the heart of the darkness. They watched and they waited, and they hoped for the first time in millions of years the ancient powers of the galaxy put their faith in the youngest species among them. The joke had stopped being funny a long time ago. Now it was something else entirely. Now it was a prayer. Captain Marco Chun was 42 years old when he volunteered for the mission that would decide the fate of the galaxy. He had been born on a refugee station because Earth was already being evacuated when his mother went into labor. He had never seen his homeworld except in pictures and videos. He had never felt real wind on his face or real rain on his skin. He had grown up surrounded by the stories of a planet he would never walk on. 3 of his siblings had died in the war. His father had flown a cargo ship into the path of the darkness to save a transport full of children. His mother had worked herself to death in a medical station treating the wounded. Marco had lost everything and everyone except the stubborn flame that burned in every human heart. The flame that said, keep going. The flame that said, never surrender. The flame that said the darkness does not get to win. He commanded the lead ship in the fleet of 12. They called it the Stubborn Hope because that was all they had left. The ships were beautiful in their desperation. They were built from the combined technology of 1,000 species. They carried weapons that should not exist. They were crewed by men and women who knew they were not coming home. The journey into the darkness took 11 days. 11 days of watching sensors go blank and stars disappear. 11 days of feeling reality itself bend and twist around them. 11 days of silence as each crew member made peace with what was coming. On the 6th day, the bright tomorrow was consumed. One moment it was there, and the next moment it was not. No explosion, no debris, just nothing. On the 8th day, they lost the Defiant Star and the Last Chance and the Remember Earth. 4 ships gone. In the span of an hour on the 10th day, the human spirit and the Never Forget and the Hope Remains were taken by the darkness. Marco watched his friends vanish from existence and kept flying forward on the 11th day. Only the Stubborn Hope remained. 1 ship against the infinite darkness. 1 crew of 47 humans who had known from the beginning, but this was a one-way trip. They reached the heart of the entity at sunset. There was no actual sunset, of course, but Marco's navigation officer had calculated that it would be sunset in New York on Earth at this exact moment. So that was what they called it. The heart of the darkness was impossible to describe. It was absence given form. It was the end of everything compressed into a single point. It was hungry in a way that had nothing to do with food or survival. It simply wanted to unmake. Marco looked at his crew and saw no fear in their eyes. He saw determination. He saw pride. He saw the same stubborn fire that had burned in human hearts since the first of their ancestors had looked up at the stars and refused to be small. It has been an honor, he said. Nobody replied because no words were needed. Marco Chun flew the Stubborn Hope into the heart of the darkness and detonated the weapon at point-blank range. Every sensor in the combined fleet recorded what happened next. The resonance weapon propagated through the entity like cracks spreading through ice. For one eternal moment that seemed to last forever, the darkness shuddered. It convulsed, it twisted in on itself, and then it collapsed. It folded inward like a flower closing. At night it diminished and faded and shrank until there was nothing left but empty space. The entity that had consumed a quarter of the galaxy was gone. The darkness had been defeated and humanity had paid the price. Elena Vasquez heard the news on the refugee station where she had spent the last 4 years. She was 91 years old, and her body was failing, but her mind was still sharp. She wept when she heard that Marco Chun and his crew had succeeded. She wept for the 12 ships and their crews. She wept for every human who had died in the long, terrible war, and she wept with joy because it was finally over. 1 month later, she stood before the council for the last time. The chamber looked the same as it had when she first arrived all those decades ago, but everything else was different. 10,000 species looked at her with something that had never been there before. They looked at her with respect. Earth will be restored, the Arbiter announced. The Council has voted unanimously. Resources from every member civilization will be allocated. This is the least we can offer." Elena nodded slowly. "We thank you," she said. "But that is not why I asked to speak." She looked around the chamber at the faces of beings she had come to know over the decades. She saw the Keth delegates who no longer looked at her with contempt. She saw the machine intelligences who had begun studying human philosophy. She saw the Vorn who had wept actual tears when the darkness fell. She saw a galaxy that had been transformed by a species they had once dismissed as primitive and violent and irrelevant. "I want you to remember something," she said. "When we arrived, you laughed. You saw a violent, short-lived, insignificant species, and you were certain you knew everything about us." She paused, and her voice grew stronger. "You were right about the violence. You were right about the short lives. But you missed the point." She straightened her old body, and something in her bearing made ancient beings look away. "Humans do not fight because we think we will win. We fight because fighting is what we do when everything tells us to surrender. We rage against the dark because the dark is there. We refuse to stop because stopping was never something we understood." She let her words echo through the vast chamber. The galaxy had grown old, and it had forgotten what that looks like. "We reminded you, and the next time something comes out of the void, the next time you face something that cannot be reasoned with, remember that there is a species in the Orion Arm that never learned when to quit." She turned and walked from the chamber for the last time. No one laughed. 200 years later, a young diplomat from the restored Earth arrived at Axis Prime to take her seat on the council. She was assigned a position in the front row in the great archives of Axis Prime. The history of the war had been recorded in 10,000 different languages. Every version told the same story. It spoke of a darkness that came from beyond the stars. It spoke of ancient powers who had forgotten how to hope, and it spoke of a young species that had arrived as a joke and had taught the galaxy something it had forgotten. Hope is not the belief that things will be fine. Hope is the decision to keep going when everything says you should not. The galaxy had stopped laughing at humanity a long time ago. It had learned instead to remember, and deep in the heart of every species that had survived the long war, there lived a small piece of that stubborn human fire. The fire that says the darkness does not get to win. The fire that says keep going. The fire that burns brightest when all other lights go out. That was humanity's gift to the galaxy. That was their legacy, and it would burn forever.